Adam couldn't stop looking at his new car. Every time he parked it, he smiled because it finally felt like all those years of working had led to something real. People noticed it too. Co-workers complimented him. Friends asked to see the inside. And honestly, it felt good. He thought, maybe this is what getting ahead feels like. But after a while, something started to change. The excitement faded, and without really knowing why, he found himself checking his bank account more often than he used to. At first, he blamed everything else. Maybe groceries were getting more expensive. Maybe inflation was the problem. Maybe he just needed one more raise and everything would feel normal again. Then one afternoon, someone asked him a simple question. What are you paying for the car every month? It seemed like small talk, but that question ended up changing the way Adam thought about money. You know what's interesting? Almost nobody walks into a dealership thinking about the total price. We look at the monthly payment first. And honestly, that's completely understandable. If someone tells you a car costs $40,000, it feels big. But if they say it's only $500 a month, your brain experiences those numbers very differently. The math hasn't changed at all. The only thing that changed is the way your mind feels about the purchase, and that tiny shift is more powerful than most people realize. Stay with me for a second because this isn't really a story about cars. It's a story about how our brains quietly make long-term financial decisions feel much smaller than they actually are. Think about almost every car commercial you've seen. They rarely spend much time talking about the full price. Instead, they focus on what the payment looks like each month. There's a reason for that. Our brains naturally compare monthly payments with monthly income because it's much easier than thinking several years into the future. Now, that doesn't mean financing is bad. Sometimes it makes perfect sense. The interesting question isn't whether you finance a car. It's how your brain begins thinking after you do. Here's the part most people never notice. The first payment gets your attention. The fifth one doesn't. By the 12th payment, it barely feels like a decision anymore. Your brain quietly moves it into a different category. It stops feeling like something you chose and starts feeling like something that's simply part of life. And that's where psychology begins taking over. Because once something feels normal, we stop asking whether it still deserves a place in our budget. Let me show you why that matters. The payment itself hasn't changed, but the way you think about your paycheck has. Before the money even reaches your account, part of it already belongs somewhere else. You don't negotiate it, you don't think about it, you simply expect it to leave. Nothing dramatic happens when the payment goes through. That's actually what makes it so interesting. The change happens quietly, 1 month at a time. I know what you might be thinking. Lots of people have car payments. You're right. This isn't about saying every payment is a mistake. The better question is this. Why can two people make the exact same payment, yet one feels financially comfortable while the other constantly feels like they're falling behind? The answer isn't usually income, and it isn't intelligence either. More often than people realize, it's psychology. Our brains are incredibly good at adapting. Something that felt expensive 6 months ago can start feeling completely ordinary simply because we've repeated it enough times. Adam noticed this after he got a raise. For a few days, he felt relieved. Then, that feeling disappeared. Somehow, life didn't feel much different than before. Have you ever noticed that? You earn a little more, but somehow it never feels like you're actually getting ahead. That's not always because you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's because your definition of normal has quietly changed without you even realizing it, and that's where this conversation starts getting really interesting. So let's keep following Adam for a minute, because what happened next is something most of us have experienced without ever putting a name to it. Every month, the payment came out on time. Adam hardly noticed it anymore. It was just another bill. Another thing that happened automatically. And that's exactly what our brains are designed to do. We turn repeated decisions into routines because routines save mental energy. The problem is that our brains don't always distinguish between a helpful routine and an expensive one. Think about it this way. Brushing your teeth is a routine. Locking your front door is a routine. Paying $500 every month eventually becomes one too. Here's what's strange. Once something becomes a routine, we stop evaluating it the way we did in the beginning. Adam spent hours comparing cars before he bought one. But after signing the paperwork, he spent almost no time asking whether that payment still fit the life he wanted. Not because he was careless. Actually, he was being completely normal. Most of us do exactly the same thing. We assume that because a decision made sense 6 months ago, it must still make sense today. But life changes, income changes, priorities change, and sometimes the payment stays exactly the same while everything else around it moves. Give me a second, because this is where a simple idea from economics becomes surprisingly useful. Economists call it opportunity cost. That sounds technical, but it's really a simple question. What are you quietly giving up every time you choose one thing over another? The interesting part is that we rarely feel opportunity cost. We only feel the thing we actually bought. Adam saw his car every morning. What he never saw was the vacation he didn't take, the emergency fund that grew more slowly, or the investments that never had a chance to compound. That's what makes opportunity cost so powerful. It's invisible. You can admire the car sitting in your driveway. You can't admire the future that never had the chance to happen. I used to think this was only about money. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized it's really about attention. We naturally focus on what we can see. The payment is visible. The alternatives usually aren't. And once something becomes invisible, our brains stop asking questions about it. That's why recurring expenses can quietly stay in our lives for years longer than the excitement that originally justified them. It isn't because people are bad with money. It's because familiarity has a way of making almost anything feel permanent. Have you noticed how quickly we stop noticing things that happen every day? Payments work the same way. That's why some of the biggest financial decisions aren't the ones we make today. They're the ones we made years ago and never stopped thinking about. And once you begin seeing recurring payments as ongoing decisions instead of permanent facts, you start asking a completely different set of financial questions. Now let's look at the numbers, because this is where the story starts making even more sense. $500 doesn't sound overwhelming when you hear it once a month, but over a year, that's $6,000. Keep going for 5 years, and you've committed $30,000 before adding insurance, maintenance, fuel, registration, or unexpected repairs. None of those costs feel shocking on their own. They arrive one at a time, which makes them easy to accept. But here's the part that's easy to overlook. Your bank account doesn't experience those costs one at a time. It experiences all of them together. Now, this isn't about saying that $30,000 should have been invested instead. Everyone's situation is different. The point is much simpler. Every dollar you commit today is a dollar that can't do something else tomorrow. And that's true whether you're talking about a car, a subscription, a vacation, or even eating out every weekend. Money is always making a choice, even when it doesn't feel like you're choosing. Think about your paycheck for a second. Before you spend anything, how much of it already belongs somewhere else? Adam started asking himself that exact question, and honestly, it made him uncomfortable. Not because he couldn't afford the payment, but because he realized how much of his future income already had a destination before it even arrived. That's a very different kind of financial pressure than simply running out of money. You can have a good income and still feel trapped if too much of tomorrow's paycheck has already been promised to yesterday's decisions. Have you ever noticed that feeling? You get paid, but instead of feeling excited, you're already thinking about everything that's about to leave your account. That's not necessarily a budgeting problem. Sometimes it's a flexibility problem. The more recurring commitments we have, the fewer choices we get to make with each new paycheck. And here's what's fascinating. Our brains don't usually measure freedom in dollars. They measure it in options. The more options we have, the more secure we tend to feel, even if our income hasn't changed very much. The fewer options we have, the more stressful ordinary expenses can start to feel. That's when Adam realized he wasn't chasing a bigger paycheck as much as he was chasing a little more breathing room. And once he saw it that way, he stopped asking, "How can I make more money?" and started asking, "How can I keep more choices?" That might sound like a small difference, but it completely changes the way you look at recurring payments. Instead of asking whether something fits into this month's budget, you start asking what future flexibility you're exchanging for it. And once you begin thinking that way, it's surprisingly difficult to look at any recurring payment the same way again. By this point, Adam wasn't looking at his car any differently. He was looking at the decisions that came before it. That's what surprised him the most. The payment wasn't controlling his life. It was quietly shaping the way he thought about every paycheck that followed. And once you notice that, you start seeing the same pattern almost everywhere. It isn't just car payments. It's phone plans, subscriptions, furniture financing, credit cards, and all the little monthly commitments that slowly become part of normal life. None of them seem like a big deal by themselves, but together they create a financial life that's already been planned before the month even begins. Here's something history teaches us. As financing became more common, people didn't suddenly become worse with money. They simply became more comfortable paying for things over time. That's an important difference. Credit isn't the problem. It can be incredibly useful when it's supporting a thoughtful decision. The challenge begins when the monthly payment becomes the only number we pay attention to. Because once that happens, we stop asking whether the purchase fits our long-term priorities and start asking only whether it fits this month's budget. That's a subtle shift, but it changes almost everything. Financially confident people often do something that doesn't seem very exciting. They revisit old decisions. Every so often, they look at recurring expenses and ask, if I didn't already have this payment today, would I choose it again? That's a surprisingly powerful question because it forces the brain out of autopilot. Sometimes the answer is yes, and that's perfectly fine. Other times, the answer is no, and that realization creates new opportunities. The goal isn't to avoid every payment. The goal is to make sure your recurring expenses still reflect the life you're trying to build. Adam eventually realized that what he wanted wasn't a more expensive car or even a higher paycheck. What he really wanted was the feeling that his future was still open. That's a feeling money alone can't buy. It comes from knowing you still have room to make choices when life changes. And life always changes. That's one of the few financial guarantees we actually have. New opportunities appear, unexpected expenses happen, priorities shift. The more flexibility you keep, the easier those moments become to navigate. That's why recurring payments deserve more attention than they usually receive. Not because they're automatically bad, but because they quietly shape tomorrow's decisions. So the next time you hear the words, "It's only $500 a month," try pausing for just a moment before answering. Ask yourself a different question. How much of my future am I committing with this decision? That question won't always change your answer, but it will almost always improve your thinking. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Financial progress isn't only about earning more. It's also about protecting your ability to choose. Because in the end, the most valuable thing your money can give you isn't a payment you can comfortably make. It's a future you still have the freedom to shape.